is Framed, and I'm your host, Dr. Julie Hunt. Today we turn to the moment that redefined the relationship between the press and power. The leak of the Pentagon Papers didn't just expose secrets, it transformed how America thought about truth, loyalty, and journalism itself. This is a story of moral courage and moral panic, of government deception and democratic renewal. And it's a story about framing, how the lens through which we view events can shape a nation's faith in itself. In our last episode, we explored the Gulf of Tonkin, a moment when the frame of national security overshadowed truth, and when the president's narrative became the nation's. What followed in the years after Tonkin was a slow unraveling of trust, of credibility, and of the story America told itself about its leaders. The Pentagon Papers would widen that rupture. They revealed that the deception surrounding Vietnam wasn't just an accident of war, it was a pattern of governance. And that pattern would set the stage for Watergate, when secrecy turned inward and the presidency itself became the scandal. So today, we're looking at the hinge point between those two eras, the moment when truth leaked and the American press found its new role as adversary. To understand what happened in 1971, we have to step back into the 1960s to a world with 3 television networks, no internet, no social media, and a public that largely trusted its government. It was an age of official narratives. The president spoke, and most citizens listened. News anchors like Walter Cronkite and Chet Huntley were not challengers to power, they were its translators. But by the late 1960s, that faith was fraying. The Tet Offensive of 1968 had already shattered the illusion that the Vietnam War was being won. Lyndon Johnson's credibility gap, the space between what officials said and what people believed, was widening into a chasm. As Irving Goffman would say, the nation's primary frame, its basic way of understanding events, was beginning to crack. Before the Pentagon Papers, the American press operated within a frame of deference. Presidents held press conferences that were carefully scripted. Reporters often knew more than they printed, but withheld out of a sense of patriotism. Even the language of journalism reflected restraint, objectivity, balance, responsibility. As Gay Tuchman later observed, this was objectivity as a strategic ritual, a way for journalists to protect themselves from accusations of bias, especially when reporting on those in power. But by 1970, that ritual was breaking down. A new generation of reporters and activists, from underground newspapers to campus radio, was demanding transparency. Against this backdrop, Daniel Ellsberg walked into history. Daniel Ellsberg wasn't an outsider. He was a Harvard PhD, a former Marine, and a defense analyst at RAND. He had worked inside the system that created the war. In 1967, when Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara commissioned a secret study of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, Ellsberg was one of the analysts who compiled it. The 7,000-page report detailed 3 decades of deception, from Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson. Ellsberg described reading the study as an awakening. He said it wasn't that we were losing the war, it was that we were lying about losing it. It was the moment Goffman would call a re-king, a realization that the old interpretive frame no longer fit the experience. The patriotic story of defending democracy had become a narrative of denial. In 1969, Ellsberg began secretly copying the report. Night after night, in a small Los Angeles office, he and his friend Anthony Russo fed pages into a Xerox machine. Each hum of the copier was an act of rebellion, a moral performance in Goffman's sense, a reframing of the story from within. Ellsberg first approached senators. None of them would act, so he went to the New York Times. Editor A.M. Rosenthal and reporter Neil Sheehan understood what they were holding, a classified history of deceit. On June 13, 1971, the Times published its first front-page story, Vietnam Archive, Pentagon Study Traces 3 Decades of Growing U.S. Involvement. The Nixon administration responded within hours. Attorney General John Mitchell demanded that the Times stop printing, claiming a threat to national security. When the paper refused, Nixon sued. It was the first time in American history the federal government had sought prior restraint on the press. To Nixon, this was not about truth, it was about control. If insiders could leak at will, the presidency itself and the illusion of mastery was endangered. But to the press, it was about democracy. The First Amendment wasn't abstract, it was a shield, and they were determined to use it. When the Supreme Court ruled on June 30, 1971, Justice Hugo Black wrote, "Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government." That sentence reframed the entire relationship between journalism and power. As Robert Entman explained, framing means selecting aspects of perceived reality and making them more salient. To promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and treatment recommendation. Nixon's problem definition, national security was under attack. The press's definition, truth was under siege. In that clash of frames, the public saw not just a conflict of facts, but a conflict of values. When the Washington Post joined the Times in publishing, journalism became a form of collective resistance, what William Gambson might call collective action framing, diagnosing the lie, prescribing exposure, and motivating the public. Behind closed doors, Nixon seized. Tapes later revealed his fury. "We're not going to let the Times get away with this." He ordered a team known as the Plumbers to prevent future leaks. That decision, meant to contain scandal, would lead directly to Watergate. Political communication scholar W. Lance Bennett described this as the spiral of scandal, the self-perpetuating cycle where exposure invites cover-up and cover-up creates more exposure. Every act of containment became a new revelation. Every denial became confirmation of guilt. Entman called this frame slippage, when a government's attempt to reinforce its own legitimacy instead strengthens the counterframe of corruption. In trying to suppress the story, Nixon ensured it would never die. In 1973, Ellsberg and Russo were charged under the Espionage Act, facing 115 years in prison. The prosecution argued that leaking classified material endangered national security. Ellsberg argued that the greater danger was silence. The trial became another stage in America's public reckoning. To some, Ellsberg was a patriot. To others, a traitor. James Entman and Theodore Glasser, in their work on journalism as moral storytelling, might say this was democracy's theater of ethics, where society negotiates who deserves redemption. But midway through the trial, it collapsed. Evidence revealed that the Nixon administration had illegally wiretapped Ellsberg and raided his psychiatrist's office. The charges were dismissed, and once again, The government's attempt at control only confirmed its corruption. After 1971, journalism would never be the same. For decades, the press had seen itself as a participant in governance, part of what Daniel Ellsberg later called the sphere of legitimate controversy. Reporters asked tough questions, but within boundaries. The Pentagon Papers blew those boundaries apart. Reporters began to see themselves not as partners in democracy, but as watchdogs, guardians of the public sphere. Todd Gitlin called this adversarial turn a cultural shift where the media's legitimacy came not from cooperation, but confrontation. In framing terms, the master frame of journalism had changed. No longer we inform the public on behalf of power, but rather we interrogate power on behalf of the public. This transformation rippled across the profession in university curricula, newsroom ethics, and newsroom hierarchies. The journalist as patriot became the journalist as skeptic. Media scholars James Lowell and Stephen Heinerman wrote in Media Scandal that scandals followed ritualistic patterns: revelation, judgment, and redemption. The Pentagon Papers fit that arc perfectly. Revelation, the leak. Judgment, the court battle. Redemption, the reaffirmation of the First Amendment. But like all rituals, it required repetition. Each subsequent scandal, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Monica Lewinsky, Iraq, WikiLeaks, replayed the same moral drama. Markovitz and Silverstein argued that democracies depend on scandal for renewal, that outrage is the way societies cleanse themselves. If that's true, then the Pentagon Papers were America's civic baptism. Yet even renewal has a cost. Over time, repeated exposure to deceit and scandal produces frame erosion, a breakdown in the interpretive structures that sustain trust. By the mid-1970s, Americans no longer took official narratives at face value. Presidential speeches were parsed for lies. Patriotism itself became suspect. As Entman observed, the same frames that once unified a society could fragment it. Goffman would call this a redefinition of the interaction order. Credibility, once performed through symbols like flags and podiums, now required transparency and skepticism. Citizens had become critics, and journalists, in exposing deception, also taught audiences to doubt. After the Pentagon Papers, every leak became part of a feedback loop. Exposure demanded explanation. Explanation invited denial, and denial generated new suspicion. Piers Robinson later explored this in his research on media and war. He showed how governments learned to manage framing environments by flooding the zone with competing interpretations. That's how the lessons of Vietnam carried into later conflicts, from Grenada to Iraq to Afghanistan. The Pentagon Papers taught journalists to doubt, but they also taught governments to manipulate. The result was a kind of frame arms race, each side perfecting its own narrative weapons. The Pentagon Papers didn't end the war, but they changed how wars and scandals would be fought. Woodward and Bernstein's investigation of Watergate was a direct descendant of the Ellsberg moment. The adversarial press became a permanent feature of democracy, but so did polarization. In the age of cable and the internet, the spiral of scandal Bennett described accelerated. The line between revelation and performance blurred, and trust, the essential ingredient of framing, eroded even further. Still, the ritual remains. A whistleblower speaks, a newsroom publishes, the powerful deny, and the public once again must decide whom to believe. Daniel Ellsberg passed away in 2023. He spent the rest of his life advocating for transparency and peace. He once said, "The courage of the press in publishing the Pentagon Papers made me proud to be an American." And that may be the paradox at the heart of this story. To love democracy sometimes means to expose its flaws. To defend freedom sometimes means to challenge authority. The Pentagon Papers remind us that communication isn't just the transmission of facts, it's the ongoing negotiation of truth. When citizens, journalists, and government struggle over meaning, they're really struggling over the soul of democracy. This is Framed, and I'm Dr. Julie Hunt. If you'd like to read more about the framing of the Pentagon Papers and the rise of the adversarial press, visit zephaniahcreative.substack.com. And for deeper dives and extended analysis, join me on Patreon at Framed Podcast. Because communication isn't just what we say, communication is history.